Well, welcome. We're glad that you're here tonight for parenting teenagers. And some of you don't have teenagers yet, but you will by God's grace someday. But even if you don't have teenagers, I think this will be a helpful session. So let's pray together. Lord, we're thankful for those of us who had godly parents and for what we learned through them, particularly in our teen years. Even for those of us that didn't have godly parents, you can still learn a lot from even unbelieving parents, and we're thankful for their influence. I pray, though, that we would have wisdom as parents and as Christians to live out the principles of the book of Proverbs. We're asking in Jesus' name, amen. So on your handout there, I put pages 1, 2, and 3 not front and back like I typically do, so that if you want to put the chart together to make it easier to see. I wish I could have fit this all on 1/2 page, but it would have been so small on the print that very few of us would have been able to read it for sure. But what I'd like to start with tonight is looking at how to parent your teenagers towards the biblical wisdom, which is the ideal of the book of Proverbs. And I want to do that we're not going to hit everything in this handout. A lot of it's just for your own personal enrichment. But I want to hit the 4 different categories of people in Proverbs. 3 of them are various shades of fools, and 1 is the biblical ideal. And of course, these are the naive, the fool, and the scoffer, contrasted with the wise person. So I'd like to start with the naive. So that'll be on page 2 of your handout. The naive is the least hardened of the categories of fools. There's most hope for the naive person. What is the naive person naive about? The consequences of sin. It's not so much that they don't know what's right and wrong. It's not that they're naive about what's right and wrong. It's mostly, I believe, that they're naive about the consequences of sin. They don't take the time to stop and think through the consequences of the sin. So we see that there in Proverbs 5, 6, and 7, the naive man that just goes straightway towards the house of the loose woman. It's not that he doesn't know that immorality is wrong. He doesn't understand the destructiveness of the choice that he's about to make. So he's naive about sin's consequences. Turn to Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 18, please. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 18. I wish I could have put the specific scripture passages and not just the references on your handout, but there wasn't a good way to make that happen. But Proverbs 14 and verse 18, Solomon says, the naive, the simpleton, the naive inherit what? They inherit foolishness. So there's probably several things that are going on there, but one of the applications from that statement is that a naive person, even though they're the least hardened of the fools, if they don't change, if they don't continue to grow to biblical wisdom, what will happen to them? They will become a full-fledged fool and then even potentially a scoffer, because he says the naive will inherit foolishness. So what do you do if you have a child, a teenager in particular, who's naive about the consequences of sin? Well, there in the 4th column, the parenting tips, appeal to your naive child to acknowledge his need for wisdom. We base that on verses in chapter 1, verse 22. Challenge him to become wise. Appeal to them to become wise. Warn him of the consequences of giving into temptation. Where his path ends, his way will end, the direction that he's on. But interestingly, one of the biggest admonishments in the book of Proverbs is to actually deal with the scoffer in order that the naive person will learn something. So quickly turn to chapter 19 and verse 25, please. Chapter 19 and verse 25. He says, strike a scoffer and the naive may become shrewd. So if you have a scoffer in your home, and I hope that you don't, but some will inevitably have to face that even as Christian parents, the best way to deal with a naive person is to deal with the scoffer, and hopefully that will help the naive person to wake up. So let's quickly talk about the scoffer, the most hardened of the fools. You see the characteristics there: the insolent pride, the mockery of what's good, scorning the parents, hating rebuke, no understanding, a corrosive influence. Proverbs 29:8 talks about how the scoffers set a city aflame. They have a corrosive influence. They can stir up a home to rebellion. And I don't want to be dogmatic on this, because God can save anybody, but there seems to be some overlap between the scoffer and the apostate of the New Testament. I'm not saying they're exactly parallel, but a lot of scoffers are apostates, and they're never going to be born again. And the warning of judgment there under the future of the scoffer is sobering for sure. Chapter 1, verse 22 tells us, dealing with a scoffer, you challenge their scoffing. But I want to show you from chapter 22 in verse 10 what you'll have to do with a scoffer. Chapter 22 in verse 10, Solomon says, drive out the scoffer and contention will go out. Even strife and dishonor will cease. So I think the application is, under parenting tips, is that if you have a scoffer in your home, you will never have peace in your home until you drive that scoffer out. Now, if the scoffer's 12 or 13, obviously you legally can't do that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But if the scoffer is of age and you've warned repeatedly and rebuked and they're not changing, then what you have to do is you have to kick the scoffer out of your home. Again, if they're old enough to do that. Why? Primarily because of their toxic influence on the rest of your children. You have to guard the rest of your children from the toxic influence of a scoffer, because they will set your home aflame. Maybe literally, but figuratively for sure, they will light things up. So, it sounds harsh, but it's reality. You must remove the scoffer from your home. So let's talk about the foolish person that gets the most attention in the book of Proverbs, what we would call the middle fool. I've heard it compared to that the naive person is like the elementary level, and the fool would be the college level fool, and then the scoffer would be the PhD level fool. So we're talking about the middle level of the fool, the university fool. And here under the characteristics, Solomon tells us they enjoy doing wrong. They have a destructive mouth. They mock sin. They're hot-tempered. They're angry. They're quarrelsome. They cause problems in a home. They're lazy. They waste their resources, both spiritually and physically. They try and hide their sin, their arrogance. Turn to chapter 12 in verse 15, please. Chapter 12. In verse 15, where we get the core of what a fool is and why he's a fool. Chapter 12 and verse 15 is Solomon says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel. So what is the characteristic of a fool that keeps him in foolishness? Thinks he's right. You can't teach him because his way is right in his own eyes. So chapter 15 verse 5 says a fool rejects his parents' discipline. A fool, chapter 1 verse 7, hates knowledge. They ignore God, and as a result, they're a grief to their parents. And we see the consequences there for a fool under the future column. One I don't have in here for you, but you could add in chapter 11 and verse 19 says, he who pursues evil will bring about his own death. The fool is headed not only for spiritual ruin, but also for physical ruin, because he continues to pursue evil, and he will likely die the premature death of a fool. So how do you respond to a fool? Hopefully you don't end up with a fool in your home, but sometimes people are saved later in life, and so they're saved when their kids are already middle school or teenagers, and they've already been hardened into this type of life. So chapter 26, if you'll flip there, chapter 26. Chapter 26, fools despise wise words according to chapter 23, verse 9, but they still need them. Chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. Solomon says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him." If you end up with a fool in your home, particularly as a teenager, you're going to be tempted to respond to their foolishness with foolishness of your own, and respond in prideful, angry, quarrelsome ways. He says, don't answer a fool according to his folly. Don't add more foolishness into the home. But verse 5 says, "Answer a fool as his folly deserves, so that he be not wise in his own eyes." Sometimes parents reach the point where they think with a teenager, I'm just going to give up. They're not of the age where you can expel them from the home, and they think, I'm just going to give up because I've tried and I've tried and I've tried. Solomon says, you've got to keep trying with a fool, or else they're going to get even wiser in their own eyes and even harder, and perhaps progress into the stage of being a scoffer. You remember from first semester, from chapter 22, verse 15, it says foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, is that all of your children start as fools. They all start as fools. So what determines whether they stay as a fool or they progress through the naive category into biblical wisdom? What will determine that? What's their defining characteristic? They don't listen to rebuke. So what's going to change a fool into somebody who's not a fool is what they do with rebuke, what they do with your instruction. So what do you want to do with a fool? Well, as I note there under parenting tips, Proverbs 20 verse 3 tells us that fools like to quarrel, so you can expect to have quarreling in your home. It's naive, but sometimes, even in my parenting, you come home or you come up from working after a long day and you just want a quiet evening, and what do you get? You have some bickering going on. And we act like this is shocking for us. Like, how could this happen tonight? Well, we have fools, right? We have fools in our homes, and so there's going to be conflict. But what I want to point out here, a common mistake that I see among parents is found in chapter 19 and verse 19. Oftentimes, parents who have fools for teenagers haven't been parenting in a biblical way. Now, not always, but often they haven't been parenting in a biblical way, and so they often, in their response to their child's foolish behavior, their teenager's foolish behavior, they don't know what to do. And Proverbs 19 and verse 19 gives us a principle that is applicable in dealing with a fool. He says, "A man of great anger will bear the penalty, for if you rescue him, you will only have to do it again." And the common mistake that I see is that parents of fools often try and shield their children from the consequences of their sinful choices. In other words, junior, a teenager, makes a terrible choice, and the parent feels sympathy for them, maybe some frustration, but they feel sympathy, and so they deliver them from the consequences. They try and shield them from the consequences of their foolish choices rather than letting them experience the full weight of those consequences. Solomon says, if you keep delivering a fool, and an angry man's a fool, if you keep delivering a fool, you're just going to have to keep doing it over and over again because they're not learning anything. So, for instance, an extreme example, but if your child were ever to, say, be arrested, I wouldn't recommend going and bailing them out the first night. Why? Because even though you feel sympathy for them and you're scared about what might happen, perhaps God wants them to experience prison life for a few days so that they can learn that they're going to kill themselves, both physically and spiritually. Let them experience the consequences of their foolish choices. If you try and protect a child from foolish choices and the consequences of their foolish choices, you will just have to do it over and over again. And much like the scoffer, because of the toxic influence of a fool, Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with wise people will be wise, but a companion, a friend of fools will be destroyed." So if you have a fool in the home, if they're of age, you're eventually going to have to kick them out. You're eventually going to have to expel them from the home for their benefit, as kind of a last-ditch effort to try and get their attention. Sorry, I didn't get enough sleep last night. To try and get their attention, but also to protect your kids from associating with a fool. And it seems harsh, but I think it's really about the only option you have. So what are some things that would be non-negotiables in the home? And sometimes people wrestle with, my kid doesn't want to come to church. Do I make them come to church? You do. You make them come to church. That's a non-negotiable. That's a non-negotiable. It's a non-starter. Modesty. That's a non-negotiable. You just don't say, well, I'll let them, don't agree with that, but they're still in my home, but I'll let them make their own choices and learn. No, modesty is a non-negotiable. The type of music that they play in the home, that's a non-negotiable. You can't have that toxic influence on your other kids. If they're bringing drugs or alcohol into the home, those are non-negotiables. And I'm not saying they violate one of those, boom, they're gone. No, it's not about trying to kick them out. It's about you appeal to them, you correct them, and if they're not willing to abide by what you're asking them to do, then eventually it gets to the point. And I can't tell you the precise moment. You'll need wisdom in each particular case. But those non-negotiables can't be compromised on. So let's talk about the wise person. I want to encourage you as a parent, and I need to do better in this myself, but as a parent, you've got to know the book of Proverbs forward, backward, inside out. Because it is your number one biblical resource for parenting teenagers. Why would I say that? Well, who was Proverbs written to? Solomon's sons. And what stage of life were they at? By and large, unmarried young men. So we're talking about teenage young men. Maybe into their low 20s, but as early as they got married back then, probably not. We're talking about a book that was written for teenage young men, and there's also application to teenage young women. So this is the book you've got to know as a parent of teenagers. So a wise child is what we're trying to develop, and obviously we can't force that, but building on what we've taught in many of our other sessions, stuff I'm not going to rehash here tonight, but as you're just consistently disciplining, teaching, family worship, correction, little by little, day by day, through the ups and downs, the frustrations, what you're trying to see developed in your children is a young person who fears the Lord, who hates evil, who is humble, who is teachable. Look at what Proverbs chapter 9 says, please. Proverbs chapter 9. Proverbs 9. Proverbs 9 and verse 8 says, "Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you." So that's better just to cast him out. Into verse 8, "Reprove a wise person, and he will what? He will love you." So kids, the primary evidence from the book of Proverbs, whether you are a wise young person or a foolish young person, is what you do when your mom and dad correct you. If you get all huffy and storm off to your room and slam the door and say, "Nobody understands me," then you're showing that it's not that your rights are being violated, it's showing that you still have a lot of foolishness in your heart that the Lord wants to work out of you, because a humble person, and I need this challenge too, because my normal response to correction is not a sanctified response. It's normally defensive. So, for instance, Lisa had to appeal to me here a couple months ago on something, and it wasn't the first time she had appealed to me on it. It's not new to me. And you know what? my first response was with Lisa when she appealed to me on this, and she did it in a proper attitude. There was nothing wrong. You know what my first response was? Oh, Lisa, thank you so much for caring for my soul. No, my first response internally was defensive. Defensive. That's we all have a little bit of foolishness left in us still. But a wise person loves the one who reproves him. I still think senior year, but my grade 12 year of high school, I was right with God at this point. When I was 14 and 15, again, I had about 18 months where I was hiding sin and not walking with God at all. And my parents didn't know. I mean, they knew something was wrong, but I was not very communicative, so they didn't know what was going on in my life. And I certainly wasn't a pleasant kid to be around. We go back and watch some of the old home videos, maybe when we're home on vacation, and I just hang my head and think, man, I was a jerk, and I didn't even realize it. I got right with God at 15, and so for my grade 11 and grade 12 years, I was right with God, but I was still had a lot of foolish tendencies and prideful tendencies in my heart. And we were would have been probably November of my grade 12 year, and we were in the school soccer championship. It wasn't a big deal. It was just the intramural program, but it seemed like a big deal to us at the time. And we were playing our big rivals. And we had killed them in the regular season. I think we had beaten them one game 5-2. So we were favored. We hadn't lost a game in any sport for probably it had been a long time. And so we were playing our big rivals. And it was a high stakes game. There was intensity. And we got out, I think, to an early 2-goal lead. We were up 2-0. It couldn't have gone any better. We're going to win this thing. But they had some talented guys. Probably one of the top 2 or 3 players in the school was on their team. And they made a comeback. And they got a couple goals. And they tied it up 2-2. And one of my best friends, Kyle Martin, who was our center midfielder, he was taking the ball down towards their goal. I was a long ways away because I played defense. But he was taking the ball down their goal, and there was contact, and he went down inside their penalty box, and we wanted a penalty kick. And it wasn't called. And so after that, their team comes back down this way, and a guy makes a move on me, and I go to do a tackle on him, and instead of getting the ball, I got him, and I took him down in our penalty box. And they called the penalty kick. I mean, it was so obvious. It was obviously a penalty kick. But I'm not walking in the Spirit at this point. And the referee from down at the other end who failed to call, they were using a 2-referee system. When you watch a soccer game on TV, usually they have a 3-referee system with 1 in the middle and then 2 linesmen. This is a 2-referee system. And so the referee from the other end came down to our end for the penalty kick. And I'm so frustrated here. I think the world's against us, and I can see this championship slipping through our hands. And so instead of getting my emotions under the control of the Spirit, guy was named Brent, and he's a good friend today. But I said, Brent, call the game both ways. And immediately, my time, reaches for his pocket, which is not a good thing if you know soccer, unless you've scored and he's going to write down the score. But he pulls a yellow card out of his pocket and sends me off. At that point, for a yellow card, you had to go off and then come back on. So I have the probably 50-meter walk of shame over to our sideline. I'm the student body president at the academy, so this is bad on so many levels here, testimony-wise. And amazingly, their best player, Jason, he missed the penalty kick. And so I was able to come back on, but my mind's so out of the game right now. I mean, I don't know what's up or down. And they end up scoring a late goal, and we lost 3-2. So we get home that afternoon, and we had planned to have a team party for the soccer team after the game later that evening. And my dad is obviously very disappointed with me. I don't remember him saying that to me, but it's just common sense. He's disappointed with me. And we're out on the back. I can still remember out behind our sliding door on our concrete slab there on our patio. And I'm talking to my dad, and he's handling it in a godly way, but he's trying to help me through what's just happened. And I want to go to this party, and he's got chores that he needs me to do, and I don't want to do the chores, and I'm so frustrated. I'm feeling the guilt of what's just transpired. I've got to go back to school and face some potential mocking for my bad example as student body president. And I think of my dad in that conversation, and I don't remember walking away from that conversation with my heart right before God. But I also remember that my dad didn't ostracize me by the way he handled it. And he knew there would be other opportunities to try and help me. He just made a few comments about it, expressed his concern about me going to the party rather than doing chores and helping around the house. But he let me go to the party. That's the tricky part with teenagers, right? There's increasing freedom, but there's also increasing danger because of the temptation that's out there. Now, the party wasn't a danger because there wasn't going to be drinking. There wasn't going to be anything like that. But I remember I didn't appreciate it at the time, but now as I look back as an adult and I think, wow, my dad handled that really wisely. It wasn't resolved in his mind when I left, but he handled it as trying to push me towards biblical wisdom. Such is the life of a parent of teenagers, right? So I want to leave the chart here on pages 1, 2, and 3 and move to pages 4 and 5 and give you some practical advice for parenting teenagers. I'm not the expert on it. We're a few years into it, and it's going fine. We have our moments for sure, but it is doable by the grace of God. And a lot of that is because of Lisa and the kids. But during the teen years, you want to make sure your kids are prepared to be on their own. So you want to teach them basic life skills, and sometimes this doesn't happen. So by the time your kids leave your home, they should have their driver's license, right? Ideally. There might be a few exceptions to that, but they should know how to drive. Particularly the girls, they should know how to cook so they don't kill their husband and kids someday. They should even practical stuff like knowing how to type. That's one thing that my parents encouraged me to do, and I'm glad that they had me do it. It saves me a lot of time now. Practical life skills. Now you say, Pastor Michael, should my kids go to university? Well, maybe, maybe not. Not all kids need to go to university. But you should ensure that they have a vocation. They may not go to university to get trained for that vocation, but they need to have a vocation that they can earn a living for their family as a man. I see some parents push their kids too hard. That's not helpful. Others are at the other extreme, and they allow their teenagers to be very lazy in school, and so their kids go out into adulthood and they're not prepared for life. They don't have a way to support a family. So prepare them with basic life skills. If you know how to change the oil, teach them how to change the oil, rotate the tires, all that sort of stuff. Prepare them for life by helping them to learn how to handle money. Now, you're not going to wait till the teenage years to do that. I forgot to mention this last time under the elementary age. From very early, you can start to teach them about money. I remember Lisa ordered some little 3-compartment piggy banks. And one side was for the church, one side was for saving, and one side was for spending. So even as 4 and 5-year-olds, you can teach them, well, you put a toonie in here, so you need to put this in here for a tithe to God, and then you can spend this. And it's challenging because some of your kids are spenders, some of them are savers. I won't tell you who, but we have two that are spenders. We have two that are saviors. So we've kind of had to adapt on the fly to help them. Well, when you get money, you can do this. You can't make a purchase on a toy for this long. You can do this. You adapt on the fly for sure, but prepare them by learning how to handle money. Of course, when they're in their teenage years, you're really wanting to see the hard work and saving developed in their lives. But even practical aspects, how do you do a budget? How do you balance a checkbook? And I know that's kind of out of vogue right now with all the online accounts. But teach them about finances. Sometimes parents might think, should I give my kids an allowance? Should I give my kids an allowance? And some of you are thinking, oh no, what's he going to say? Did I do it right or did I do it wrong? I don't think there's a right or wrong here. Now, I'll let you know what we do. We don't give our kids an allowance. Horror of horrors. Now, you might choose to give your kids an allowance. Why might you choose to give your kids an allowance? Maybe you want to do it as part of learning how to handle money, of budgeting and setting aside and saving. So if you choose to give your kids an allowance for that purpose, good on you, more power to you. You won't get a criticism from me. But the reason that we don't give our kids an allowance is because I don't think it teaches them accurately about how life works. What do I mean? I don't want my kids to think that when they grow into adulthood, somebody's going to give them money just for being alive on the planet. Life doesn't work that way. And so unless you're very careful in how you do an allowance, I think you're giving them false assurances about how life is going to work someday. You say they'll grow out of it. Well, maybe, probably. But if I can help them to learn that now, then I want to help them. So involve your teens in chores around the house. That's a non-negotiable. As Dr. Tripp mentions in the reading, you don't pay your kids for fulfilling normal household responsibilities. That's borderline bribery and manipulation. So you don't pay them for making their bed. You don't pay them for cleaning their room on Saturday or whatever day of the week. You don't pay them for doing the dishes on the night that it's assigned to them. You don't pay them for taking the trash out. You say, how will they learn about money? Well, then what Lisa and I have done, it's not the only way to do it, but what you can do is you can give them extra chores that do carry financial reward. And by that I mean come up with other jobs that you do pay for. Not the normal household stuff that's just part of their regular routine. So for us, we do this on stuff like, who wants to wash? Well, most of the time we go down to the car wash for that. Who wants to sweep out the van or the car? They sweep out the van or the car, we'll pay them a little money. Now, when I was a kid, that was part of my regular household chore. So I'm not saying, kids, that you should protest if you do that and your parents don't pay you for that. But just things like that, extra chores that they can do, that they can make a little spending money, they can learn to save and tithe and all those things. I want to encourage you to expose your kids to a variety of opportunities. Usually we push our kids towards what we like. So my natural instinct would be sports. And we have our kids in sports. But give your kids a variety of opportunities for music, for different types of lessons, for art, for speech, all of these sorts of things that help them to grow into a well-rounded adult. But I want to caution you to be careful. In our culture, the competition, we don't have the competition that some of the Asian cultures do, for sure. It is intense in some of those Asian cultures in school and jobs and university. So we don't have that in North American culture as much, but there still are some families that just drive their kids and drive their kids and drive their kids. And usually it's not for the kids' benefit. Usually it's because of the parents' pride and fear of man. So don't overextend them or yourself and your spouse with too many events. So here's a really important biblical principle. As your kids are getting older, their extracurricular activities can tend to dominate the family schedule. And Lisa and I haven't figured out exactly how to make this work, but you're adapting on the fly. But do not let your kids' work schedule, your teenagers' work schedules, or extracurricular school activities determine your family priorities. Let your family priorities determine what activities your kids are going to be involved in. So what do I mean by that? If your kid says, I want to get a job, and you say, okay, how many hours are you going to work? Okay, 15 hours a week, that's reasonable. They've done studies and they show that university students can usually work about up to 15 hours a week and it not be detrimental to their studies. But with teenagers, maybe they say, all right, I'm going to do 10, 15 hours a week. What days are you going to work? Okay, Sundays. It's only twice a month, Dad. Sorry, no working on Sunday. You're not going to miss church for Sunday. I mean, you have to decide about Sunday afternoon in between. But for our family, our biblical priorities, work is not going to determine whether they come to church or not. That's just a non-negotiable. Or for instance, a sports team. This is why we don't have our kids involved in travel teams. One of the reasons is because travel teams invariably take kids away from church. So is it wrong to be a professional Christian athlete? Well, that's a whole nother topic. But we're not pushing our kids that way. Why? Because I don't want them to be out of a local church on Sunday mornings for 25 years of their life, if they were to succeed. And that's a very small percentage that do. So don't let your kids' extracurriculars determine your family priorities. I have a note here. Don't try and protect your kids from all pain. Some parents do this. You think it's frequently mom or dad? Often mom, yeah, but dads do it sometimes. We don't like to see our kids hurting. But there's a couple of reasons why you can't protect your kids from all pain. Number one, it's simply impossible to do. Only God can do that, and He's chosen not to do that. Number two, God uses pain to shape them into the people He wants them to be. Now, certainly, you don't keep your kids in any unnecessary danger. You don't leave them in any unnecessary pain. But there's just stuff that we can't control. So let God be God, and you just be a limited, fallible human parent. As your kids grow older, they don't ask as many questions as they did when they were very little. You know, why this? Why that? You know, what's this? All the questions you get peppered with. They do ask questions, but they're different types of questions, right? So you've got to shift from telling them what to do to telling them why we do it or don't do it. The philosophy, and we'll talk more about that here in a couple. I think the April 30th Bible Institute, where I want to talk about going for the heart of the child and how to develop standards in your family without being externalistic or drifting into worldliness. So we'll come back to that. On to page 5 here. We're coming down the home stretch. I want to briefly talk about the appeal process. Dr. Tripp deals with it. But it is important that your kids know that they can come to you to make an appeal without you biting their heads off. So this means you've got to be living in the fear of God and you've got to be humble. They won't agree with every decision you make. But as long as you're not encouraging them to sin, and I hope that's very rare, then certainly they can appeal it. If you are encouraging them to sin, then of course they're under no obligation to do that. And they shouldn't do it. But there's a few things I want to encourage you, and this can start even when your kids are elementary age. So your kids are, let's say, elementary age. Your child's playing a video game, and you say, okay, time to go to bed. Turn the video game off, go upstairs, get your clothes on, teeth brush. So this would be, lower elementary age, not a 2-year-old. All right. And so they say, in a minute, Mom, in a minute. And what do you say at that point? Well, you say, no, you need to go up to your room for correction because they didn't obey you, right? Now you say, well, what if they appeal? So here's what I encourage you to do. You give them the instructions. If they don't obey, you correct them. Maybe it just needs a verbal correction. Maybe it needs verbal correction and a spanking. But you allow for an appeal process. So what I encourage here is you tell them what to do, and they think, oh no, I'm about to beat Mario Brothers 3, Super Mario Brothers 3. I'm right there. But they obey you, they put it down, and they start to head up the stairs, and they say, Mom, can I appeal to you on something? And if they're 6 or 7 years old, they may not use the word appeal, but they say, Mom, I'm happy to obey you, but could I make an appeal? Sure. What's the appeal? I'm this close. How long will it take? 3 minutes. Okay, you can go finish it. And so if they start to obey, express a willingness to obey, then they can appeal. If they're just persisting in their disobedience, then there's no appeal at that point. You're dealing with their disobedience, not whether they can finish what they were trying to finish. Same thing with teenagers. You tell them, no, you can't go stay at your friend's house this weekend. And so they say something like, okay, Mom and Dad, I will submit to that. Then they say something like, but can I make an appeal? And you say, sure. They make their appeal. You listen to their reasons. And as Dr. Tripp points out, you need to be in the habit of saying yes to your children unless there's a good reason to say no. A lot of our default mode, and I can slip into this, is to say no. Default mode should be yes unless there's a good reason to say no. And then you consider, probably talk it over with your wife, you consider their appeal, and then you come back with a decision. You say, can they appeal that decision? Yes, they can if they come and present new information. We're not just going to recycle this conversation 40 times in a row and bang our heads against the wall. But yeah, if you have new information, then come back with the appeal. That's not explicitly written out in Scripture, but there are some biblical, I think there's some biblical wisdom there that can help you with that appeal process. Okay, let's conclude here with one of the hardest parts of parenting teens, and that is knowing how to correct them. Because as I've said before, your teens, you should not be spanking teens. I've made that clear, right? Now, I'm not saying you're sinning if you do, but I would question your discernment if you do. You should not be spanking teens because they're too old in my estimation, and you're going to probably provoke them to wrath. So you verbally continue to instruct them and try and impart biblical wisdom, but instead of physical correction, what you can do is you can withdraw privileges. Now, I'm not a big fan of long groundings. So they make a bad decision and say, okay, you can't leave the home for 3 weeks. Probably not a good idea on several fronts. And one of them, as Dr. Berg points out, who's feeling the brunt of that at that point? Who are you punishing? You're punishing mom. She's stuck for 3 weeks with a miserable teenager. Not helpful. So I'm not a big fan of extensive groundings, but what I think you can do with teenagers is you can withdraw privileges. Correct them by withdrawing privileges. I encourage you to do it this way. Look at how God chastens us as his children. He doesn't punish us. Jesus took that punishment. But how does God discipline or chasten his children? Usually the correction fits the crime, matches the crime. In other words, not only in proportion, but nature of the correction. Right? So think about David. When he stole Bathsheba and had Uriah killed, he destroyed Uriah's family. So what happened to David's family? What was God's chastening on David? Well, part of it was God let David's family be destroyed spiritually. So my dad recommends, and the phrase here I have in italics is from my father, take away what motivated their disobedience. So try and get down to what was motivating the disobedience. So when I told you to come home at 10 o'clock, why didn't you come home? What was it that was driving the disobedience? And then if you can determine, you can't always determine it because they may not even understand their own hearts and you can't figure it out. But if you can determine what motivated the disobedience, then you can withdraw that privilege, usually temporarily, as a way of trying to get their attention and encourage them not to do it again. Again, I'm not talking about usually for weeks or months on end, but oftentimes with teenage boys, a correction that is helpful because it smarts a little bit is taking away video games for a time. So find something to correct them with that fits the nature of the disobedience. What do you do when your teenagers have sinned and they come to you and voluntarily confess that? Well, based on the teaching of Proverbs 28, verse 13, that he who confesses his sin will obtain mercy. Whosoever covers his sin will not prosper, but whoever confesses it will obtain mercy. If your teenager tries to hide their sin, and you really have to dig down to try and uncover it, then the consequences are going to be greater. But if they voluntarily confess it to you, they come of their own initiative and say, Mom and Dad, you don't know about this, but I need to tell you something. Then you extend a lot more mercy in the nature of the consequences. So it doesn't mean there won't be consequences. You might have to put some parameters in place to try and protect them from having easy access to how they got into sin. But if they voluntarily come to you and confess their sin, then you extend more mercy. Now, if you have to go into investigative mode and you question them and they lie and they lie and they lie and finally God reveals the truth another way, then the consequences are going to be more significant. Why? Based on that principle in Proverbs 28, verse 13. And, of course, increase privileges and responsibilities in proportion to their wise choices. Trust is earned, but don't make it impossible to earn. Don't be an impossible parent to earn trust by. If you're needing some biblical encouragement, I'd encourage you to start with Proverbs. If you're really frustrated as a parent of a teenager, and I'm not, this is not personal testimony, I'm not frustrated. We don't have perfect kids, but we're thankful for what God's doing in their lives. I could recommend the book by Dr. Tripp's brother, Paul Tripp, called Age of Opportunity. It's a little bit redundant, so you may not read it from cover to cover, but the first part of it is really excellent. And he communicating there that rather than dreading the teen years and being overwhelmed and frustrated with it, this is an age of opportunity to see God do something great in your teenager's life. We generally think that every teen is going to rebel. Now, you don't have to raise your hand on this if you don't want to. I'm not trying to make anybody comfortable. But how many of you went through your teen years without having a significant period of rebellion against your parents? How many of you went through your teen years without a significant? This is not a prideful thing. Just raise your hand. Okay, yeah. You're like, well, okay. All right. You don't want to appear prideful. I mean, my sister... She was a joy to parent. I didn't parent her, but I'm sure for my parents, she was amazing. My brother did not give my parents a lot of trouble at his early teen years, right? I was the most trouble for my parents. It was about 18 months long. So it doesn't mean if your kids rebel during their teen years or have a period of rebellion that you failed. So we don't have to dread these years. We can do what we've done in other stages and look to biblical wisdom. All right, thank you so much for joining us online.